The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, though it was not a letter at all, but a folded notice nailed to her door. And by then Adelaide Ferris was 21 years old and had nothing left in this world but the clothes on her back, $11 sewn into her hem, and a name that men in Coldwater Gulch, Colorado Territory, had learned to say with a sneer. She had been cast out by Silas Broom, her late father's business partner, who claimed the Ferris cabin and the last of the family's tools to settle a debt that existed only in his ledger and nowhere in her father's hand. With those $11, and against the laughing advice of every soul in town, she walked to the courthouse steps and bid on the one property no one else wanted. The old Whitcomb Mountain Mine Tunnel, sealed and abandoned for 11 years, sold for $4 because the county wanted it off the tax rolls. They called her a fool for buying a hole in a mountain. They did not know that behind that sealed rock face waited something that would not only undo the ruin done to her, but would restore an entire town to what it once was, and expose a wrong that had been buried longer than the tunnel itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Ferris. If you have ever been counted out before anyone gave you the chance to prove otherwise, we think you will feel this one in your bones, so before we go further, take a moment to follow or subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story like it. And while you're here, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. We love knowing how far these old stories travel. Now, let us begin. Adelaide had been born in the spring of 1866 in a canvas tent pitched at the edge of a diggings camp that would, within 2 years, become the town of Coldwater Gulch, nestled where a green river cut down out of the Sawtooth Range and widened into a basin rich with silver-bearing quartz. Her father, Thomas Ferris, was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, a surveyor and assayer by trade who had come west not chasing a fortune, but chasing steady work. And he found it in Coldwater Gulch, testing ore samples for the dozen small mining outfits that sprang up along the gulch walls. Her mother, Miriam, had died of a fever when Adelaide was 6, and so it was her father who raised her, in the particular way that lonely, careful men raise daughters, by teaching her everything he knew, as though knowledge were the only inheritance he trusted himself to give. By the time she was 10, Adelaide could read the veins in a piece of broken rock the way other children read primers. She knew the difference between fool's gold and the real vein by its smell after a hammer strike. She knew how to read a surveyor's transit, how to plot an adit's bearing through solid granite, how to calculate a shaft's grade so that water would drain instead of drown a working. Her father used to say, half joking, that she had more mining sense in her small hands than half the men who called themselves prospectors in the territory, and though she blushed at the compliment, she treasured it, because it was one of the only times he told her she was worth something in a world that did not often say so to girls. It was her father's other gift to her, though, that mattered more than any surveying skill, and that was his belief that nothing valuable in this world announces itself loudly. He used to take her out to the tailings piles that other miners had abandoned, the crushed rock and debris thrown aside as worthless, and he would sift through it patiently, showing her how the men before them had been in such a hurry for the big vein that they'd tossed aside smaller seams of ore that were, in their own way, just as precious. Everybody's always looking for the obvious thing, Addie, he told her once, crouched over a pile of gray stone with the sun behind him. But the world buries its best truths in what looks like nothing. She did not understand then how prophetic those words would become. She only knew that she loved him, and loved the mountains, and loved the particular hush of a mine tunnel's mouth in early morning, when the cool breath of the rock met the warming air outside, and made a soft fog that curled like a living thing. Thomas Ferris partnered, in the last years of his life, with a man named Silas Broom, a smooth-talking assayer's agent who arrived in Coldwater Gulch in 1881 with capital from back east and an easy smile that fooled nearly everyone, including, for a time, Thomas himself. Broom proposed they open a modest new claim together on Widow's Ridge, splitting costs and profits evenly, and for 2 years the partnership seemed to prosper. But Thomas began to notice discrepancies in the assay reports Broom filed with the county recorder. Ore grades reported lower than what Thomas's own tests showed. Small percentages skimmed here and there. Debts recorded against the partnership that Thomas never authorized. He was a careful man, and careful men keep careful notes, and in the last winter of his life, weakened by a lung sickness that had crept into him after years of dust and cold, Thomas Ferris began quietly compiling proof of what Silas Broom was doing, not just to him, but, as he was beginning to suspect, to half the small claim holders in the Gulch, who trusted Broom's assays and accepted his numbers without question. Thomas died in January of 1885, before he could bring his evidence to the Territorial Land Office, and Adelaide, then 18 and suddenly alone in the world, was left to grieve a father and inherit a partnership she barely understood, with a partner who wasted no time turning grief into opportunity. For 2 years after her father's death, Adelaide tried to hold together what remained of the Ferris claim and the small assay office her father had run out of their cabin. Silas Broom was, on the surface, patient and even kind to her, offering to manage the business side while she was still in mourning, and because she trusted the name her father had once trusted, she let him. It was the costliest mistake of her young life. Broom slowly restructured the partnership's paperwork, filing new debt instruments against the Ferris property to cover manufactured losses, paying himself management fees from funds that should have gone to Adelaide, and by the time she was 20 years old, she discovered, far too late, that she no longer owned any legal share of her father's claim at all. When she confronted him, Broom simply smiled that easy smile and told her that grief made people misremember agreements, and that the papers, duly filed and notarized, said what they said. The town, for its part, largely sided with Broom, not out of malice, but out of the ordinary human tendency to trust the man who wore a clean coat and spoke smoothly over the young woman who had, in their eyes, simply failed to manage her father's affairs. Whispers followed her that she was too proud, too strange with her surveying talk, too unmarried and too alone to be trusted with a man's business. It did not matter that none of it was true. In a town built on the fickle luck of rock and river, reputation could erode as fast as any hillside in a flash flood. The final blow came on a bitter February morning in 1887 when Broom's men nailed the foreclosure notice to her cabin door, citing a debt she had never incurred, secured against a property she no longer legally held any claim to defend. She was given 4 days to vacate. She spent those 4 days doing the only thing she knew how to do in the face of disaster. She made careful notes, she asked careful questions, and she walked, cold and proud, to speak to the one man in town who had never sided fully with Broom. Old Judge Harlan Pruitt, who ran what passed for the county's legal affairs from a single room above the mercantile. The judge could not undo the paperwork. It was, infuriatingly, all correctly filed under the letter of a law that had never been built to protect people like her. But he told her one thing that changed the course of everything that followed. The county, in an unrelated matter, was preparing to auction off a derelict piece of property, to clear it from the tax rolls, the old Whitcomb Mountain Mine Tunnel, sealed for over a decade after a partial collapse had killed 2 men and driven off its last owners, considered by everyone in Coldwater Gulch to be cursed, worthless, and best forgotten. The auction was set for the very day her eviction took effect. She had $11 to her name. The tunnel, the judge told her almost apologetically, would likely go for less than that, because no one wanted it. She stood on the courthouse steps that morning, in a hand-me-down coat with her father's old surveyor's transit case slung over her shoulder. The one possession Broom's men had not thought valuable enough to seize. And when the auctioneer called for bids on the Whitcomb tunnel, there was a long, ugly silence, followed by laughter, followed by someone calling out, "Let the Ferris girl have her hole in the mountain, she's already ruined anyway." She bid $4. No one bid against her. The gavel came down, and Adelaide Ferris, 21 years old, homeless, disgraced, and utterly alone, became the legal owner of a sealed, collapsed, cursed mine tunnel on the shoulder of Widow's Ridge, and nothing else in the entire world. She walked up to the tunnel that same afternoon, in weather-threatening snow, carrying only her father's transit, a coil of rope, a hand lantern, and a small crowbar borrowed from the blacksmith on the promise of future payment. The mouth of the tunnel had been boarded and then further sealed with a rough timber and stone barricade after the collapse 11 years earlier, and it took her the better part of 2 hours, working alone in the cold with numb fingers, to pry enough of the boards loose to slip inside. The air that met her was exactly as her father had once described it, that cool, exhaled breath of stone, and beneath it, faintly, the mineral smell of wet rock and old timber that she had loved since childhood. She lit her lantern and stepped into a passage that had not felt a living footstep in over a decade. The first 50 feet of the Whitcomb tunnel were unremarkable, roughly cut and shored with old, softening timbers, the kind of hasty work she recognized from her father's teachings as the mark of miners in a hurry to reach ore rather than build for permanence. But as she pressed deeper, her lantern light catching the damp walls, she began to notice something that made her slow her steps and press her palm to the stone. The rock face here was not the crumbling shale that had supposedly caused the original collapse. It was solid granite, carefully worked, and at a bend some 120 feet in, she found a second, smaller barricade. Deliberate, not accidental, built from cut and fitted stone rather than the haphazard rubble of a cave-in. Someone, after the collapse, had come back and sealed something further inside on purpose. Her father's old training rose in her like an instinct. Nothing valuable announces itself loudly. She spent the better part of an hour working the seal loose, stone by careful stone, her fingers bleeding, her breath fogging in the lantern light, until at last a gap opened wide enough for her to squeeze through into a small work chamber that the original collapse had never touched at all. Inside, she found a miner's strongbox, rusted but intact, wedged into a carved niche and wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the damp away. Her hands shook as she pried it open. There was no gold inside, no glittering fortune of the kind that legend might promise, only papers, carefully folded, and a leather-bound ledger, and a small hand-drawn map marked with symbols she recognized instantly as her own father's surveying notation. She sat on the cold stone floor with her lantern guttering and read by its dying light long into the evening, and what she found there would unravel everything Coldwater Gulch believed it knew about its own history. The ledger belonged to a man named Amos Whitcomb, the tunnel's original owner, who had died in the collapse 11 years before Adelaide was born to this story. Though she soon realized, with a chill, that Whitcomb had not died in an accident at all, according to his own final entries. The ledger recorded, in increasingly urgent handwriting, that Whitcomb had discovered a rich vein deep in his tunnel in 1875, one substantial enough to sustain the whole struggling camp for a generation, and that he had brought in an assay agent to confirm it, a young, ambitious newcomer named Silas Broom. Broom, the ledger stated, had confirmed the vein privately to Whitcomb, then turned around and filed a false report with the Territorial Land Office claiming the tunnel was played out and structurally unsound, in order to buy time to stake a competing claim on the same vein from a different angle before Whitcomb could properly register it. When Whitcomb refused to be quiet about the fraud and threatened to go to the land office himself, the collapse occurred within the week, and Whitcomb's final entry, dated the night before his death, stated plainly that he feared Broom meant to silence him, and that he had sealed his true survey records and a written account of the fraud deep inside the tunnel, in a chamber only he knew how to find, so that if anything happened to him, the truth would not die with the mountain. Adelaide sat with that ledger clutched to her chest for a long time, the lantern nearly spent, understanding with a slow, cold certainty that the man who had destroyed her father's reputation and stolen her inheritance was the very same man who, over a decade earlier, had likely orchestrated the death of Amos Whitcomb to bury this exact vein. A vein that, according to Whitcomb's carefully rendered map, ran not just through the collapsed section of the tunnel, but curved directly beneath the very chamber where she now sat, untouched and unmined for 11 years. She realized, too, with a different kind of ache, that her father must have suspected something of Broom's pattern of fraud even before their own partnership soured. Perhaps he had heard whispers of the old Whitcomb affair. Perhaps that was even why he'd grown suspicious enough to keep his own careful notes. Whatever the truth, she now held in her hands both the proof of an old murder disguised as accident and the map to a vein of ore that could restore not only her own fortunes, but potentially fund the recovery of half the failing claims in Coldwater Gulch, many of which she now understood had also been quietly defrauded by Broom's manipulated assays over the years. She did not sleep that night, curled in a borrowed shed behind the blacksmith's, turning the ledger's pages over and over by candle stub, memorizing every figure, every name Whitcomb had recorded as a fellow victim of Broom's schemes. She recognized several of them, the Delacroix family, whose claim had failed mysteriously the same year Broom arrived, old Tobias Renner, who had sold his stake to Broom for a pittance after being told, falsely, that it was worthless. A pattern 11 years deep, and she alone now held the paper trail to prove it. Word travels fast in a gulch town, and it was not 3 days before Silas Broom learned that the Ferris girl had been seen climbing daily up to the Whitcomb tunnel with a lantern and a crowbar, and that she had, according to the blacksmith, been asking pointed questions about old Amos Whitcomb's death. Broom did not panic outwardly. He was too practiced a liar for that. But he moved quickly and quietly to protect himself. He first tried charm, calling on her at the shed with an offer to buy out her worthless tunnel claim for $50, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to her a week earlier, and which she now recognized, with grim satisfaction, as an admission of guilt in itself, since no man pays $50 for a hole in a mountain unless he knows precisely what it contains. She refused him, politely, and watched his easy smile falter for the first time since she'd known him. When charm failed, Broom turned to influence. He went to the town council and argued that the Whitcomb tunnel had never been properly resurveyed after the original collapse, and that its auction sale to Adelaide should be voided on grounds of undisclosed structural danger, a technical argument designed to strip her of the claim before she could formally register any new find. He found allies easily. The same townsfolk who had mocked her purchase now worried, with Broom's gentle prompting, that the Ferris girl was going to get herself killed poking around in a cursed hole, and that the council ought to intervene for her own safety. Judge Pruitt, to his credit, resisted an immediate ruling, but he warned Adelaide plainly that Broom had influence enough with 2 of the 3 councilmen to force the matter within the week, and that she would need more than her father's old ledger of suspicion to stop him. She would need incontrovertible proof, properly witnessed, before the council convened. So Adelaide did the one thing that had always been asked of her and never once been enough. She went back to work, quietly and thoroughly, the way her father had taught her. She returned to the tunnel not to hide from Broom's threats, but to finish what Amos Whitcomb had started, a full, formal survey of the true vein, using her father's transit and her own trained hands, cross-referencing every bearing against Whitcomb's original map until she could prove, beyond any council's ability to dismiss it, that the vein existed exactly where Whitcomb's ledger said it would. Directly beneath the very ground Broom had spent 11 years quietly trying to claim through a shell company he'd registered under his wife's maiden name. A detail Adelaide uncovered only by matching Whitcomb's list of Broom's associates against the county's land filings. A tedious cross-check that took her 2 sleepless nights at the recorder's office by candlelight, with Judge Pruitt, moved by her diligence, quietly allowing her access after hours. She also went, one by one, to the family's Whitcomb's ledger, named as Broom's earlier victims, the Delacroix family, old Tobias Renner, 3 others besides, and showed them, gently and without accusation, the pages that named them. She watched something long buried move across each of their faces, not surprise, exactly, but the particular grief of finally having a private suspicion confirmed. One by one, quietly, they agreed to stand with her before the council, not out of vengeance, but out of a shared and long-delayed need to see the truth spoken aloud in the town that had, for over a decade, chosen the easier lie. The council meeting was called for the 2nd Saturday in March, ostensibly to rule on the safety and validity of the Whitcomb tunnel claim, and the meeting hall was fuller than anyone could remember it being, packed with the curious and the concerned in roughly equal measure. Silas Broom arrived in his cleanest coat, composed and smiling, prepared to argue technicalities of mining safety law, and he was visibly unsettled to see Adelaide arrive not alone, but flanked by Tobias Renner and the elder Delacroix son, with Judge Pruitt seated at the council table, with an expression of careful neutrality that nonetheless carried a weight Broom had not anticipated. Adelaide spoke plainly, without theater, laying her father's training bare in every measured word. She did not accuse Broom first of murder or fraud. She began instead with the survey, unrolling her freshly drawn map beside Whitcomb's original, showing bearing for bearing how precisely they matched. Proving the vein's existence and its location beneath ground, Broom's shell company had quietly filed to claim only 8 months prior, a filing date that made no sense at all unless Broom had known about the vein for years and had simply been waiting for the cursed reputation of the tunnel to keep others from looking too closely, while he arranged to seize it legally. Only then did she produce Whitcomb's ledger itself, reading aloud, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. The dead man's own account of the false assay report, the sabotaged claim, and his fear, recorded the night before his death, that Broom meant to silence him for good. The hall went utterly silent. Tobias Renner stood, unprompted, and spoke of the pittance he'd been paid for his own worthless claim on Broom's word alone. The Delacroix son spoke of his family's mysterious ruin the same year Broom arrived. It was not one voice the council heard that afternoon, but the accumulated weight of 11 years of quiet, individually born injustice, finally spoken together in one room. Silas Broom did not go quietly. He rose, red-faced, and attempted to dismiss the ledger as the ravings of a bitter dead man and the map as a forgery cooked up by a grieving, desperate girl. But Judge Pruitt, who had spent 2 evenings independently verifying the recorder's filings Adelaide had uncovered, calmly produced the county's own land records showing Broom's shell company filing, dated and stamped, that corroborated everything Adelaide had said about his timeline of knowledge. The easy smile that had carried Silas Broom through 11 years of quiet theft finally, visibly, cracked. He was not, in the end, tried for Amos Whitcomb's death that afternoon. That would take a territorial marshal and a longer reckoning than one council meeting could provide. But the council voted unanimously that day to void his fraudulent claim filings, to restore the disputed partnership assets to their rightful owners, including, first among them, Adelaide's father's original share of the Widow's Ridge claim, and to refer the matter of Amos Whitcomb's death to territorial authorities for formal investigation. Broom left Coldwater Gulch within the month, his reputation, built so carefully on charm and paperwork, gone to dust in a single afternoon, and though we will not say his name was ever spoken again with anything but contempt in that town, we will say that the quiet justice that found him was not the kind delivered by an angry mob, but the kind delivered by patient, careful truth, which, as Adelaide's father had always taught her, is the only kind of justice that actually lasts. What Adelaide did next surprised nearly everyone who thought they understood her. She held, now, clear legal title to the richest vein Coldwater Gulch had seen in a generation, running beneath both the Whitcomb Tunnel and the restored Ferris claim. And she could have kept every ounce of its profit for herself, and no one could have faulted her, after all she had endured. Instead, she did something her father would have recognized instantly as pure Ferris instinct. She organized the vein's development as a cooperative claim, offering shares not just to herself, but to every family Broom had defrauded over the years. Renner, Delacroix, and the others, structured so that the tunnel's wealth, so long buried and so nearly lost to greed, would rebuild the whole gulch rather than crown a single fortune. She used her father's transit to personally survey safe new workings through the granite, honoring both Whitcomb's memory and her father's careful methods. And within a year, the mine that the whole town had once called cursed was employing 24 men at fair wages, funding a proper schoolhouse, and quietly repaying, family by family, the losses Broom's fraud had inflicted across more than a decade. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began, with a girl of 21, cast out with $11, mocked on a courthouse step for bidding 4 of them on a sealed and worthless hole in a mountain. Everyone in Coldwater Gulch believed, that cold February day, that Adelaide Ferris had made the most foolish purchase of her ruined young life. They did not know that her father had spent her whole childhood teaching her that the world buries its best truths in what looks like nothing. And they did not know that a dead man's ledger, sealed for 11 years in patient stone, was waiting only for someone careful enough, and wronged enough, and stubborn enough to go looking where no one else thought to look. Adelaide did not restore her fortune by chasing the obvious vein everyone else had already picked over. She restored it, and an entire town's, by trusting the overlooked, sealed, and forgotten thing that everyone else had already written off, which was, in the end, exactly what the town had once done to her. Thank you for sitting with us through Adelaide's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that being counted out is not the same as being finished. Before you go, we'd love to know, is there a time in your own life when you found real value in something others had already dismissed as worthless? A person, a place, or a thing others gave up on too soon? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.